George, if you're looking for more people, there's a scroll. Look for a little arrow, and you can maybe scroll and see more people. There's an arrow maybe on the right hand of your screen or left hand of your, that you, if you see an arrow, if you click on it, it gives you more people. I'm not sure which device you're on that you can look at that.
Well, I got, it says participants on mine, so
Oh,
that's
okay.
what I pressed.
Okay, yeah, and then there should be an arrow or a little arrow, or if not an arrow, then a little bar on the side that you can go up and down with that'll show you more participants.
Yeah, I'm going all the way down to the
And
bottom.
you've gone all the way? Oh, good job.
And I don't see Don's name on my list. I got,
Oh.
see, I got 29 names on my list.
You've got if you got Don Zabel, I don't have Don Silverta on mine. I've got Don Zabel on mine, but I don't have Don Silverta.
I don't have Don Zabel's name on it.
Oh.
He must have
Don,
fallen
can you hear
off.
us?
Don Silver is here.
Okay.
That's interesting.
Okay, we see.
Huh.
Okay, we'll get started and hopefully he gets back on. Good afternoon. My name is David Cray, the current president of the Rotary Club of Roseville. Please stay muted until you would like to make a comment to avoid background noise. Please recite the flag pledge and the four-way test to yourself while muted while I lead the group. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The four-way test of the things we think, say, or do. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial for all concerned? With that, I'd like to ask Terry Gilberstadt for the invocation. Terry?
Okay. Hi. All
Hi.
right. I'm coming to you from Phoenix, where it is 79 degrees. I just looked. It's actually been really breezy and really nice out here. We just got here last night. Anyway, when I got an email this morning from Kathy about an invocation, I started thinking, okay, what would be interesting, or what would be something that I've been thinking about? Well, I've been thinking about people who went through struggles at various times. And I went to the bookshelf out here, because a lot of books I've already read, I leave out here. And the Bonhoeffer book right here of his life, it maybe comes backwards. Anyways, that book came to mind about somebody who really struggled for something he believed in a tough time. And I think all of us are having a lot of feelings about the struggles and the unfairness and how we are all going to solve things as a group. And then I went over to my dad's for coffee this morning, and his caregiver had bought him new placemats that say, always stay humble and be kind. And I looked at that and thought, oh, that's really kind of an invocation topic that, as we're sort of digesting all of this, thinking how can we help, and how can we as Rotarians be helpful and help with a hugely divisive and terrible issue, and how we can help in the world to help unite things. And I think our club too has done a wonderful job with the food sharing and all the things we do, and work with the community. So I think, just continuing our road and staying strong and being humble and kind, I think is a pathway we can have. And at these times, I sure appreciate all the things we do with Rotary. Thanks.
Thanks, Terry. Record reporter today is Lauren Swanson, who just stepped away. Thanks, Lauren. Guests, we have a couple of guests. Lonnie, can you unmute yourself and introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. I'm Lonnie Starmo, and I'm from the Stillwater Sunrise Group.
Okay, thanks for joining us today. Chad, could you unmute yourself and introduce yourself?
Morning, Chad Fanning. I work at Weber Johnson Public Affairs, and I work with the University of Minnesota to do government relations and community outreach. So I organize events like this across the state. Happy to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us today. And I think that's it for guests. I'll do a joke. So Jan and I and a number of other Rotarians were on a virtual meeting with the Roseville, California Rotary Club. And while Jan and I were talking to the gentleman that sets up the meetings, or the speakers, we were talking about jokes, and he gave me a joke. So I'm going to use his joke. Jan didn't think it was funny, but how many tickles does it take to make an octopus laugh? 10 tickles. 10 tickles. 10 tickles. See, he's still growing. I'm sorry, Jan. We'll do happy dollars. So please be brief. And then I don't know if we're going to meet in person for a while, but the Rotary year ends here soon. So if you could make a donation to Polio Plus on my Rotary, on the Rotary International website for the happy dollars that we've done last almost 3 months now, that'd be appreciated. So with that, does anybody have happy dollars? Something
Yeah,
you want to say?
I've got some
ahead,
happy
Ted.
dollars.
Okay.
I guess I'll have to pay 5 or 10 for this, but I bring greetings from District Governor Xavier from District 9211 in Uganda. I was on a club fellowship meeting this past week with them, which was a memorial for the founder of their club who had recently died, a fellow by the name of George, I think it was Mekambe or something like that. And then secondly, I was talking on Saturday with Paul Musaho, the past president of the Rotaract Nakavali Club in Uganda at the refugee settlement. He was selected to be on a Rotary training for officers in the district this past Sunday. And so we worked for about 3.5 hours working through the kinds of ideas he could share on the panel. And he reported today that everything went very, very well. In fact, it went so well, the district has now nominated him to be a Peace Fellow at Makerere University in Kampala. So I wanted to share those things with you.
All right, thanks, Ted. It's awesome. Mary Jo, go ahead.
Pay now. Thank you for giving me a better. I went on, but I need to go into the right place to pay for my happy dollars. But I'm super excited today. I don't see Julie Warren on here. I mean, first of all, I'm going to give some happy dollars in recognition of the peaceful protesters that were keeping peace when all around them might have been showing otherwise. And I'm just going to recognize people that were sharing their point of view in a way that wasn't violent. And I'm going to give them a shout out on that. Also, I want to recognize of the Roseville on Parade, which is the roses that are being painted at the State Fair right now in the Merchandise Mart. I don't see Julie Warren on. I know she's doing some media with that this morning. I've been there twice already, and I've been watching the progress of this painting of these 18 roses that are gorgeous. So I've been doing all my walking now over at the fairgrounds so that I can see these. So this week they're going to still be doing that, and I'm going to go one more time. And I guess on Friday or maybe after this weekend, they'll be moving them now then to their locations. And I think in July she said they're going to be, you know, having their big grand opening. But if you get a chance to go over to the Merchandise Mart at the fair and see these Roseville in bloom, Roseville, that's what it is, Roseville in bloom, roses that are being painted. It is really, really, really cool. And you can meet the artists while they're doing it. I've been talking to a lot of them. Anyway, wanted to give a big plug for our Roseville in bloom.
TSC has one where ours is Flower Power.
Is it? Oh,
Beauty. Yeah.
oh wow. I'm going to look for that when I go. Yeah, they're great.
Thank you, Mary Jo. Anybody else have any happy hours like to share?
Yeah, this is Ed.
Go ahead, Ed.
I was visiting with my in-laws this last weekend, and they've had their name on the list to get in the Eagle Crest along Snelling for better than a year, and they got the call last week. So they're going to be moving to Roseville from Detroit Lakes. So we're pretty excited to have them down here. And I told them I would take them with me to Roseville Rotary. So hopefully we'll be back meeting in person. Some of the Rotarians know him. Or know of him, certainly. Don Silverta used to ski with his brother, and Don Severson is his cousin, so he does have some club connections there.
Well, we're excited to meet him when we actually can start meeting in person. That's awesome. Thank you. Anybody else have anything they'd like to share? Raise your hand or let me know.
Rick Goodmanson here.
Rick.
I'll
Go ahead, Rick.
I'll throw some happy dollars in to expand on Mary Jo's Roseville and Bloom. There's actually 19 roses, but ours is Goodmanson Construction, and our artist was concerned about being in a group setting, and so we had our rose painted off-site somewhere. And then Goodmanson Construction is handling all the transportation to and from the fair and out to the businesses and stuff. So it is a really cool program, and I've seen all the roses also, and they're really incredible. So one of them will be also in our storefront. So it's a cool program. So that's it.
Well, thanks for being a partner with that, Rick. Anybody else have anything to share? Okay, with that, we'll go to special announcements. I'll introduce, or have Lonnie please talk about the Rotary Foundation. He's with the district, wants to mention some stuff on that. So go ahead, Lonnie.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it, David. And, you know, for me, one of the reasons, well, let me just kind of back up. So the reason I'm here to talk on behalf of this, and I know you guys have already been talking about it, and you're very active in the foundation already, is just have a new outside voice come and just speak for the district foundation. I've been involved with the district foundation for the last year. I've been part of the foundation leadership at our club for the last few years. And my primary reason for joining Rotary is the opportunity to do good in the world. I mean, really, that's the reason I've shifted all of my charitable focus on Rotary. And as I've gotten involved with the foundation, my wife and I have made a huge shift of our charitable giving to the foundation. And we decided to do that for two reasons. One is because of the high charity rating that this has and the efficiency that I see the foundation having. But the second one, the most important one to me, rather than just giving my money and going off and forgetting about it, is that I have all the ability in the world to be involved with what happens with my money, either through our club involvement or through working on an actual project or even sponsoring a grant district project, which I'm actually doing this year. So, you know, this to me is a really, really good way to give back to the world and to do good in the world. And you may have heard or remember, if you've talked about it, I think in the last meeting, is that because we're having a shortage of money for all the grant projects that are being brought forward, there's a special focus in this last few weeks of the Rotary year to reach a goal of $400,000 so that we can, sponsor as many projects as possible. And I know many of you have probably already given to the Rotary already this year. If you have, and you have the ability to do it again, think about giving a little bit more in the last few weeks before the end of June so that we can try to hit this goal of $400,000. If you have thought about donating, but you have not, and you're able to do so, I know this is a tough year for some people, especially economically. Maybe you can't, but if you can, it's really, really easy to do. I know I've demonstrated for our club several times that if you just go to rotary.org, top right-hand corner, there's a donate word. You click on that, and you literally can make a credit card donation in less than 2 minutes. It is that easy to do, and we just ask you that you consider to do that. And then the last thing I'll mention is that there is a special program this year that if you can donate before the end of June, $365, essentially the equivalent of $1 a day, the Rotary Foundation will match that and have you become a Paul Harris Fellow. So there's an opportunity, if you haven't been a Paul Harris Fellow before, to use this type of program and get in and have that kind of recognition around what you're doing. So just remember, it's the end of June. Please consider this as one more way that you can do good in the world. I know this club has been very active. I know David Cray, I met you as part of the Shark Foundation, the Foundation Shark Tank that we did a few weeks ago. And so I know you guys have been very active, and just ask you to consider donating one more time to the foundation before the end of the year.
All right, thank you, Lonnie. Along with that, then also we were involved with the Suburban Ramsey COVID-19 Response Fund. I know Maria and Jan, Julie and I have been meeting with that. It's 14 North Suburban service clubs that have gone together. So our fundraising effort to date just got past $50,000. And we've already issued some grants. $5,000 grants were awarded to 3 nonprofits, the Community Support Center, the Keystone Community Services, and the Neighborhood House, all dealing with food insecurity and housing issues. So things are going good. We've also made 50 isolation gowns. We've done some volunteering as well as a group. So if you want to get involved with that, or you want more information on how you can participate in committees or fundraising or volunteering, let me know and I'll get you on the right information for that. So making a difference there in our Roseville community. Anybody else have any announcements they'd like to make?
Hi, everyone. David, I think that you summarized it very well. And we know that there are a lot of nonprofit organizations that are hurting, including our own Rotary International. But if you can spare any more, we are trying to help locally, and we would really appreciate the help too.
Yeah, so an email went out earlier from Kathy with all the Facebook links and the website to the coalition. So should all be there in your email.
I just wanted to add one thing that it's tempting because my book, after I make break even, I was going to donate some money to Rotary Club and the my North Korean refugee group, but that the $365 thing really kind of tempting me to do it before I make break even with my book. So I might do that. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else have anything they would like to bring up before we bring our speaker up? Okay, with that, Deb, could you introduce today's program and speaker?
I'd be honored to. Mark Thomas is a professor of neuroscience and scientific director of the Medical Discovery Team on Addiction, a new research program funded by the state legislature to fuel cross-disciplinary collaborations and discover new treatment options. His research examines how addictive drugs alter the brain and how these changes can lead to compulsive drug use. His lab is now focusing on ways to disrupt addiction relapse. His ultimate aim is to curb addiction where it starts, in the brain. At presentations, he will discuss the unique research being conducted in our own backyard state, the University of Minnesota, along with the potential implications of addiction treatments for our society. He will also discuss the reasons why Minnesota is the perfect place for this research to occur, as yet another example that the University of Minnesota brings tremendous value and pride to our community. Please help me give a warm Rotary wave to Dr. Mark Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you, Deb. Thank you all. I'd like to share my screen. I'm not sure if I have that option yet.
Yes, you do. I made you.
Oh, I do.
Should be able to do that.
Let's see. So, okay, there we go. You'd think I'd be good at this now. I've been teaching with this thing for a bit now, which is an unusual experience. How's that? Can I get a thumbs up from somebody if we can see that?
That's good.
Okay, great. Thank you. I just wanted to, and thank you for that introduction. I wanted to say a few words about where I came from, how I came to be doing the work I'm doing. I grew up in the Twin Cities area here, actually in Little Canada, so nearby, and went off to do my college work at Northwestern University in Chicago, and then I was at UCLA for graduate school, where I got my PhD in neuroscience. Had a stint in Northern California at Stanford as a postdoctoral fellow, University of Michigan, and I made my way back here to Minnesota. Glad to be back. Been here since 2003 when I started up my lab to study addiction in the brain. So I've been at it now for the better part of 2 decades. And it's been this recent money that we got from the state that really allowed us to form this medical discovery team. It's a few years old now. That has just galvanized our efforts, it's a, if I may say, a pretty incredible collaborative venture among scientists to try to get at this problem of addiction from the demand side, which I'll talk about in a few minutes here. So I'm a biologist of the brain. I study how addictive drugs affect the mouse brain is what we study in my lab. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the studies that we're doing there. But in our team, we have people who study this from all different angles of biology. And I want to take a few minutes to discuss that biology. So this is Neuroscience 101. I'm just going to briefly go through some important ideas here that will help the rest of the talk make more sense. And I'd like to say, if you would like to unmute yourself, jump in at any time and ask a question as we go. I'd be very happy to take questions throughout as well as at the end, assuming we have time. And I hope we do. Speed me along if I'm being too verbose. Okay, so this is my favorite Neuroscience 101 slide. If you had to sum up what the brain does in one slide, here we can go with this. So we take in sensory information from the world, and it gets processed in the brain to produce a kind of appropriate behavior for whatever conditions, whatever environment we're in, under most conditions. But there are cases where certain people, when exposed to chronic addictive drugs, the processing that happens in the brain is changed. It's changed in such a way that it directs behavior, directs our thoughts and cognition towards drug seeking and drug consumption. That happens to some people who are exposed to chronic drugs, but not all. And so we're trying to understand, what are those changes in the brain that happen in some people, and why are they so hard to undo? So just delving into this a little bit, there are various different, as we've learned over the past more than 100 years, and some of it going well back beyond that actually, there are different parts of the brain that have different functions. And here in this diagram that looks very complex, but to us studying it, this is actually a vastly oversimplified version of what we call the reward circuit. So this is a part of the brain or parts of the brain that manage our reaction to rewarding stimuli in our environment. Rewarding stimuli, natural rewards being things like food, opportunity for sex, building social networks, and these sorts of things. Okay, so there we've discovered over many decades that there are these regions that can communicate with one another and manage the signals that come in from our environment to lead to these what I call appropriate behaviors for a given environment. So where did this all come from, and when did it start? Our sort of modern neuroscience of reward started back in the 1950s with folks up in Montreal, Canada, James Olds and Peter Milner and their colleagues, and some of you may remember this from Psychology 101, but if you implanted, and what they did was implanted a tiny electrode, a tiny wire down into a very specific part of the brain, and they were asking the question, what if we pass a little electric current through that wire into the brain? They really didn't know what they were going to find. And frankly, they were kind of poking around in different areas. They knew at the time that the brain worked on electrical signals. But the question was, what if you applied those electrical signals yourself rather than letting the brain do it by itself? And they found a certain region of the brain that if they allowed the rat, in this case, to press a lever which activated that electrical signal, that the rats would press that lever again and again and again to get that electrical signal. And so it was this pretty amazing finding they didn't expect. And after mapping these different regions out in the brain where they could give an electrical stimulus and produce this kind of lever pressing response, that really led us to our map that I showed you earlier of those different parts of the brain that participate in what we now call the reward circuit. And this, what I want to show you in this video is a 21st century version of this kind of reward stimulation procedure. And this is a mouse from our lab. And it has, in this case, not an electrical signal, but a light signal that we activate down in the brain when the mouse goes into the top right corner of this arena that it's in, okay? So every time it enters that top right corner, you can see there's a little kind of green cap on its head there that lights up. That's actually an optic fiber that's implanted deep down into the brain, into the reward circuits, and it activates neurons with light. And so this animal's wandering around. It's never been in this arena before, but it learns very quickly that if it goes into that top right corner, that it's going to receive this light stimulation, this neural stimulation in the reward circuit, and it comes to do this again and again. Now, so this is something that we already knew, but we wanted to demonstrate that it worked with this kind of a new technique that's called optogenetics, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. It has some useful properties for studying reward circuits, and we've taken advantage of those in our addiction work. So this is, I showed you before a cross section through a human brain. This is a cross section through a mouse brain, and the point that I wanted to make here was that that a mouse brain, although it on this, very much smaller than a human brain and has some obvious differences. The cortex, the outer portion of the brain is much smaller in proportion to the rest of it than it is for our human brain. But the reward circuits are laid out in the exact same way as they are in the human brain. They use the same neurochemicals. If you look under a microscope at the neurons, you can't tell the difference, but for the size. And so there are a great number of advantages in studying the reward circuits of mice and rats, in that they really mirror what we see in people. But we can do more invasive studies, and we can do before and after studies in ways that we just absolutely cannot do with people. So some of the work I'll be telling you about later has to do with these kinds of animal studies. So one of the very key neurochemicals in this reward circuit is something probably all of you have heard of. It's the neurochemical dopamine. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's a signal that chemical signal between neurons that helps them to communicate with one another. And something that I always like to mention in these talks is that if you read maybe a Time magazine article or something like that about reward circuits and addiction, you're going to see dopamine in there, and often it's referred to as the pleasure neurochemical. And this is it's a misnomer, and I think it's important to point this out for the following reason. So look at this is a measure of dopamine here on the y-axis of this graph on the left, and this is how much dopamine is released in a rat. We can put a chemical probe down in the brain. We give a rat that's relatively hungry a piece of food, and we see a little blip in dopamine. It goes up. Now look what happens on the right-hand side if we give that rat an injection of amphetamine. And this is just a relatively low to modest dose of amphetamine. You can see that dopamine rate, and then the scales are even different on these graphs. You get incredible blast of dopamine released when amphetamine is injected. And you know, you see, I'm showing you this data with amphetamine, but you see the same thing with cocaine. You see it with opioids like morphine or heroin. You see it with nicotine. You see it with alcohol. So all these different drugs that humans can abuse and have problems with, we see this blast of dopamine occur in the reward circuit at the time when the drug comes, as we say, on board. And so I mentioned that it's often called the pleasure neurochemical, but after many different studies over decades, what those of us studying this in detail now agree is that it's not a signal for pleasure. It's a signal for do it again. This is it's a motivational signal. So something, in other words, something important is happening in your environment, something that's important for your survival, do this again if at all possible. And so that's a very different kind of signal the brain's getting than what many of us think of with the ingestion of a drug that people might abuse, like a euphoria kind of effect. This is do it again if at all possible. It's important for your survival. And so I like to mention it, that it's important because it puts a different lens on how we think about those people who have difficulty in stopping themselves from ingesting addictive drugs. Their brains have been rewired. Their brains have been rewired to have intense motivation to seek these drugs out. And we think not because of the pleasurable effects, although this may not be a conscious awareness to them, but because what their brains have experienced over and over again is, you need this to survive. Okay, so I'm going to leave that point aside. We can return to it in the questions. But I want to point out just a few of the statistics here. I won't go through them each individually, but I'll leave them up there for you to look at. We know that this is a problem in our society that's widespread. It's very damaging, and it's difficult to treat. It's very costly, and it's costly not only in terms, as I have noted here, in economic terms, but of course it's costly in personal terms, and many of us have been affected personally by this, and it's a tragic thing. When we started this project, and we were getting some attention for it, we started to get emails from people every week. You know, my daughter, my grandson is having a problem. They've tried everything to stop. They've tried all these treatment programs. Is there anything you can do to help them? And it's just heartbreaking to get these messages from people. And we're working hard on it. We don't have anything yet that we can offer that are new treatments, but I'll tell you about some avenues that we have to work on those sorts of things. But it's widespread, it's costly, and it's difficult to treat. We have a number of different critical research topics that we're working on, and I'll just tell you briefly about the categories of things we're working on, and then tell you in more detail about one of them. So we, as neuroscientists, we think about the addiction problem as a problem of the demand rather than the supply. So oftentimes you hear about the supply issue because that's kind of like what we think maybe is the most straightforward way to deal with this as a society. If we only had less availability of these substances like heroin, fentanyl, you know, things that we hear around the opioid epidemic, oxycodone, you know, if we could limit the availability, we could solve the problem. But we've been looking at it that way for a very long time. And it turns out to be a very challenging problem to limit the supply. And we think that another important avenue is to think about how to limit the demand. So where does the demand come from? From the brain and from these reward circuits that I've been talking to you about. So if we could discover where and how to intervene in these addictive brain patterns to disrupt craving and relapse, we'd have some very important tools to address this problem in society. In terms of opioid epidemic, if we had non-addictive pain relievers, that would put a big dent in it, because for many kinds of pain, opioids are still the best choice to reduce that pain. It's just that the other problems they cause are significant. So if we had a way around that, that would certainly be a great benefit. There's a new avenue using addiction targeting vaccines. And this is kind of what seemed to me to be a little bit of a crazy idea at the beginning, but it's turning out that it might be a really interesting and useful avenue, disrupting the ability of addictive substances to actually reach the brain. So using our body's own immune system to destroy those chemicals before they can get into the brain where they're causing havoc. And we have one of the world's experts on addiction-targeted vaccines here at the University of Minnesota that we recruited over the past couple of years as part of this team. So I want to tell you about this first one here, the addiction brain patterns, and that's something that my lab's been working on for the past almost 2 decades. And let's look here at the cross-section of an MRI through a healthy human brain. And now I wanted to show you, this is what an addicted brain looks like. And I'll give you just a second to look and see if you can note the differences between those. And I'd be very surprised if you could, because I've tricked you. Those are actually the same image. And I apologize for that, but I want to make the point that when we look at this sort of macro level, we don't see any differences at all. And if we were looking at something like Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's, we'd see some very big differences, and we could identify those, and we could home in on them and try to study them in more detail and find therapies that could be directed by those changes. But we don't have that option here. And so we think, does that mean there aren't any brain changes? No, we don't think that's what it means at all. But I like to think about this in terms of an analogy of a computer circuit. So this is a computer circuit from a modern laptop, the central processing unit. So here's one that's working well. Here's one that's infected with malware. Now you can't see any differences between those, but if you turn on the computer they're connected to, you will see a difference right away. And that is how we think about the brain in addiction, that there's a certain amount of rewiring that occurs, and that with the proper, I guess you could say, virus, antivirus programming, we might be able to make some advances in how to treat this. So our studies have focused on this tiny but powerful region of the brain. Here again is a human brain cross section. It's what's shown in red is the nucleus accumbens, and that's the area that receives dopamine from other parts of the brain, and where that motivational signal, do it again, comes from. And there are changes that occur in this part of the brain as a result of chronic drug exposure, and we've known that for many years, but trying to understand them better and in a more detailed way that could actually lead to some potential treatment has been our main goal. And so here's another diagram just showing that nucleus accumbens area here. So I'm going to tell you a quick story about how this part of the brain is altered with repeated opioid exposure. And here in the lab, we've been doing experiments with morphine, which is one of the canonical opioids. It's easier to work with than some others, like heroin, for example. And so we've used that in some of our initial studies. We've treated the mice for a relatively short amount of time, 5 days, with a modest dose once per day of this opioid, and then waited for a couple of weeks for the initial symptoms of withdrawal to subside, because we wanted to see are there changes in the brain we can identify that last over time. It's something that we know happens in addiction, that many years after, in some cases, people stop taking their drug of choice that they were having problems with, that there's something that's different still there. There are triggers in the brain that can lead to relapse that outlast drug exposure itself, and that's what we're looking for. So 2 weeks later, we're looking at the brain here using a technique that's called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. And so if you've ever seen reports in the newspaper or what have you of these colored regions of the brain that are activated, this is the technique that's most often used. And in fact, at the University of Minnesota, we have one of the world's leading centers for this kind of technology. And one of our big goals is to leverage that technology to use in our questions of interest in terms of the neuroscience of addiction. It really hasn't been done. And we have this incredible opportunity with this technical expertise, with the incredible technology that we have, and the new people that we've hired to use this technique to its full advantage. And so here what we've found is that there are changes in the function of the brain, connecting the prefrontal cortex to the nucleus accumbens here after repeated opioid treatment. And this lasts beyond when the opioids are actually in the system. So this, even 2 weeks after and beyond, we see this change in the brain and how it functions. And we wanted to find out what that might mean in terms of behavior. So our goal was, what if we could find a way to take this opioid treated brain and restore it to a control brain that had not had opioids? Now that sounds sort of science fiction, and it was a daunting goal to start with, but there were some new techniques that were becoming available in neuroscience that allowed us to alter the strength of connections between different brain regions using light pulses. And that's what I was showing you earlier with the mouse who kept going back into that upper right corner of that arena it was in. With a certain pattern of light stimulation, we can alter this connection and actually return the opioid condition back to a normal condition. And I'll show you that in a second here. But what we really wanted to know was, if we were able to do that, how would it affect the animal's behavior? And so we needed a way to study the behavior. And this is, I'll just run you through here quickly, a sort of standard technique in our field that is probably easiest to explain if we call this drug-paired side of the environment the opium den, okay? So if we put a mouse in this environment, typically it can run back and forth between these two different sides of a chamber, okay? And we'll give it a half an hour to an hour to do this per day. And if you put it in there for the initial test, if you set up the conditions right, it doesn't really care what side it's on. It explores it, it'll spend equal time on both sides. But if you take 3 days and pair an opioid injection with placement onto one side of this chamber and confine the animal to that one side, when given the chance, it will then spend its time now on this drug-paired side, even if drug isn't available. Okay, so it's come to associate this area with being, in a sense, an opium den. It will go back and spend its time there. even without drug. I see that there are a couple of comments here. Maybe there are questions. Oh, thank you. Comments. Again, if you do have questions, though, please unmute yourself and jump right in. Happy to take them whenever. And a lot of times I'm not being clear about these things. So if you have a question, it's likely many others have the same question. Okay, so we have this way to study them. Oh, yes, go, good.
So what I'm hearing is that is addiction a disease or a choice? I'm trying to figure out what you're trying to say as far as addiction. So how do we view it, a disease or a choice?
Oh boy, that's a good question. And I would like to answer it by saying it's a disease of choice. And what I mean by that is that we have decision-making machinery, and how neuroscientists think about it. We have decision-making machinery here that we use every day for everything we do, and that that machinery is mistuned and can become misaligned in a way that can support decisions that really aren't for the long-term good of a person. So is it a choice? It involves choice, but it also, because of this sort of misalignment of the choice machinery, if you're following me, it makes making the right choice very difficult. So stacking the odds against a person in a way that, you know, at least for some, they never make it out of there. And so, you know, how it's to me fascinating. I mean, disturbing, but it's a fascinating question to study. You know, because it gets really right at the heart of the mind and brain interface. You know, the what is physical and chemical versus what is something that seems beyond that. I don't know if that I might not have been a totally satisfactory answer to your question, but that really is how we think about it.
I will take it.
Okay, thank you. So back to this question of behavior. So we have this way to study whether the mice are sort of motivated to seek out the drug. But really one thing that we're interested in is this idea of relapse, which is a key part of the problem in the clinic for addiction, because many people who are having difficulty with their drug of choice, whatever it may be, can stop. They can stop for a time, but staying off is the real challenge. And as I mentioned, we do believe that's because there are brain changes that long outlast the exposure of the drug itself. And so we want to have a way to study those in the lab, and this is kind of a very simplified behavior model to do that. So this, what is on the left is what I've shown you already, the opioid exposure and the more time spent in the quote unquote opium den. With repeated exposure to that environment though, and without any drugs, the animal sort of loses its preference for that side. Okay, so it goes back to exploring both sides equally. But what if we prime the animal by giving it in this case, opioid injection when it's not in the environment, but then put it back into this environment to give it the choice between sides? What happens then is this little reminder, this little taste of the drug reintroduces this drug-seeking response, and the animal goes back to spending its time on the opium den. So this is a model for relapse that we use in the lab that was useful in this case, because what we wanted to do, as I mentioned, was to use the optogenetics, this light stimulation, to change the brain in a specific way back to the way it was before, and then see how that affected this relapse behavior. And that's what's shown here on this next slide, focusing on the neurostimulation. So we took the animals through this opioid training. They went through the period where they didn't have any drug and they lost their preference. And at that point, we gave them a stimulation, and the stimulation lasted for 10 minutes. So it was very brief, a single bout of this 10-minute stimulation. And then 4 hours later, we injected them with morphine, and we gave them the opportunity to choose between the opium den and the neutral side. And what we found was that the neurostimulation group, that there was a block of this opioid relapse effect, and that's what's shown here. So this is the relapse group, showing more preference for that drug paired side. And this here, the last bar, was the group that had the neurostimulation. And I should have a better image of this, but I have to go back here to show you. The basic idea was that we were stimulating the brain in such a way that this increased connection between the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens was gone. And so they were back to a kind of normal connectivity between these two parts of the reward circuit. So that's one example. It's in some ways, it's a very simple mouse model for an aspect of addiction in the lab. So we can't directly translate this to something that we could use in the clinic for people, but it gives us a lot of hope that by engaging the brain in some very specific ways that don't have side effects that we can tell, which is key, that we might be able to realign parts of the reward and motivation circuit of the brain in ways that can produce a kind of return to normal decision making, where the drugs aren't outweighing the more natural rewards, which is what I think most people who are struggling with it would very much appreciate, that they had that opportunity back to choose the things that are the natural rewards in their lives rather than this chemical reward. So we based on these sorts of experiments, we're building a team to try to figure out how we might attack this problem in people. And a good part of it is to, as I mentioned before, to leverage those neural imaging resources that we have here at the University of Minnesota. But another part of it is the neurostimulation part. So right here, I've showed you experiments using a kind of invasive procedure and we can't yet do this kind of light stimulation in people. But there are other ways to use electrical stimulation in people. You've probably heard of deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's patients, for people who have intractable tremors at rest in Parkinson's that the drugs aren't able to help, that some of those people have neurostimulation. And that frees them from these tremors that can be so disruptive. There's also non-invasive brain stimulation that involves not brain surgery like deep brain stimulation would, but stimulation through the skull. And we're doing work on all these different fronts to try to figure out how we could come up with treatments that would affect the demand side, which we think is so important in addiction. And some of the people that are working on this now, we have actually, there are over 40 faculty at the university in all different departments that are working with us on these issues. But we've hired a number of what we call rising star junior faculty through the money that we've gotten from the state. And just so thrilled to be working with these people. We've gotten them here from all different parts of the country and different parts of the world. We've outcompeted Harvard and MIT and University of Michigan and UCLA and UPenn to get these folks. We're just so thrilled to be working with them. They have all different kinds of expertise, they're happy to be here because we have this collaborative environment here that is different than other places. So that's another one of our resources beyond the sort of neurostimulation hub that we are and the imaging expertise that we have. Just this collaborative atmosphere, which goes beyond the university out into the community. I mean, Chad has hooked me up now with a number of these Rotary Club talks, and I'm so appreciative to speak to you and these audiences, because you are a great example of our caring, concerned citizens. And these people coming from Germany and from Boston and from Texas and Los Angeles, and they're drawn in by that. It's like, oh, the state put in money for this, and the people are behind it. Yes, they are, and they feel it, and it's one reason why they've been so easy to attract here, even with our winters that they have to contend with. So I'm gonna say one more thing here before I stop for questions, which is that if you're thinking about how you can help, one important way that you could help is by supporting the university itself. So about 1/3 of the budget comes from the state legislature. And if you are still that are up for discussion right now, because the money that's put in, it's money that supports the education and outreach and some of the facilities that we have. But and some of this is indirect, but it